All right, guys. So over the next 6 weeks, we are in the book of Daniel. I was really been looking forward to this, so I kind of stumbled my way through Ezekiel, only to know that at the end there was going to be this fun 6 weeks we get to have with Daniel. And I'll have to say, this is my second favorite Bible story of the Bible. This particular chapter is my second favorite. My most favorite Bible character is definitely Joseph. I love Joseph for so many reasons. I can identify with his life in so many ways, and so he is my favorite. But Daniel is my close second, for sure. What a wonderful man, what a wonderful book. Just so you know, there is no shortage of supply of study material for the book of Daniel. You wouldn't think of it that way, but you would think of the New Testament has a lot of study material, and it does. But Daniel is probably, out of the Old Testament, maybe besides Genesis maybe, has as much study material as any book in the Old Testament. And and there's a couple reasons why. First, it's the most authenticated book in the Old Testament. And there's a reason for that, too. It's because it's one of the most attacked books in the Old Testament. And a lot of it has to do with...
prophecies.
Yeah, it's prophecies, for sure. One of the other reasons is that it's a date of origin. There's a lot of liberal biblical teachers and Bible scholars that believe that it was written after 200 BC, which would be a real problem, because then if it was, it becomes a historical book instead of a prophetic book. And so there's a lot of arguments about that, about the fact of when it was written. And there's also another aspect about the book of Daniel is who wrote it. There's a lot of argument about who the author is. And so Daniel is a lot of third person references in Daniel. But again, that's not unusual. You see that a lot throughout the Bible. Even God spoke of himself in the third person. So that's not that unusual, but it's for some reason it seems to be an issue in the book of Daniel. But there has been vigorous pushback by a lot of conservative Bible scholars on this, against these liberal teachers. And there is some definitive proof, some that's on display in certain places, that proves its authenticity. And also, by the way, as far as the author itself, Jesus himself told us who the author was. In Matthew 24:15, if you want to look it up, you can for yourself. And because this is Jesus' words, he said that Daniel was the author. So if there's I don't know why there's an argument about that. If we can't believe Jesus, who can we believe? So that's just a little bit of an introduction to the book of Daniel. You could do a lot more. There's actually a really good YouTube video on the introduction to Daniel. I've played one of them before, where it's a sketch thing where it goes through the whole book, and it's really neat. For instance, it'll tell you things like that part of the book is written in Hebrew, and then part of it's written in Aramaic. That's a whole different I won't even get into that today, because that's another thing that people have arguments with about the book. Like I said, the book of Daniel has as much study material as any book. If you're ever wanting to study the book of Daniel, it's out there. But you might want to be careful where you pick your material from. So with that in mind, let's read. I want to read the entire chapter. It's not that long, but I think we need to read it all. Our text for our lesson today is actually verses 8 through 21, but there's no way you can start in verse 8. You got to start at the top. So let's just begin in verse 1. I am reading out the authorized, so it's a little antiquated, but I think it's very descriptive, and I like it. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and such had the ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which the king drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, and for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and of Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your meat and your drink. Why should he see your faces worse liking than the children of which are of your sort? Then you shall make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove your servants, I beg you, 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and waters to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before you, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as you see, deal with your servants. So he consented to them in that matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat of the portion of the king's meat. Then Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine which they should drink, and gave them veggies. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had an understanding in all dreams, visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them. And among them all was not found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and all the astrologers that were in his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. Oh, this is a good story. I love stories like this. I love it. I couldn't wait for today. Today was like Christmas for me, getting to teach a story like this. Well, let's go to the Lord and ask him to bless our time in his word this morning. Father, thank you for your word that you've preserved. Thank you for this story that you recorded. I'm so thankful that you let Daniel write this and record what happened in this instance. There was probably other things like this that happened in history that we don't have record of, but thank you for recording this one. It's such an encouragement. It has been an encouragement, and it will continue to be an encouragement to me to take a stand for my God as long as I live. Bless us as we read your word this morning. In your name we pray. Amen. So in verses 1 and 2, hey Amy, how you doing?
I went to the old classroom.
Oh, no problem.
Where are they?
So in verse 1, you see it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, of Jerusalem, and besieged it. And you notice in verse 2 it says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And then it continues on. But I want to focus on these first 2 verses here, especially verse 1 and 2, or the first part of verse 2. So we have this king of Judah. His name was Jehoiakim. Does anybody remember what his dad's name was? He comes from good stock. Jehoiakim's dad was the king of Josiah. Do you remember how old he was when he became king? 8. Very good. And do you remember one of the first things he did when as a young boy? He did something very powerful as a young man.
He broke down all the things of Baal and Asherah poles and found the scrolls to read God's word.
Sure did. And he reopened the temple and brought back worship, and like it was supposed to be done in Solomon's temple. He was a great young man, a great king. Now his son Jehoiakim was after the death of Josiah was was the next king of Judah, but he didn't inherit the throne like you would think. He was actually placed in throne by Pharaoh. Now, I don't have the time to get into the history of this, but if you look at the end of Josiah's life, he made a bad decision. He made a bad alliance. He made some decisions that just weren't good. They weren't wise. The majority of Josiah's life was a good godly king, but at the end he made a mistake. We just got to be honest about that. And so Jehoiakim didn't necessarily inherit the king. He was placed there by Pharaoh of Egypt. And essentially he was a vassal king. If you're familiar with the term vassal, then you realize it's basically he's a puppet. He was put there so that he would keep peace with the people because he was the son of Josiah, but essentially all the strings were being pulled by someone else, and the term to describe that is called vassal. Verse 2 reveals who it is that's pulling the strings, and we see there that it's listed who's pulling them. And, the people may not have been completely aware of who was doing this, but the king was. And it's this is not the first time in the Old Testament where you see vassal kings, by the way. You see that happening a lot, and God allows this. I mean, we see in verse 2, you see it says, and I tried to emphasize this when we read this, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. We're talking about Nebuchadnezzar here. So Nebuchadnezzar, thinks that he's done some great thing, but really, in a way, Nebuchadnezzar was a vassal king to God Almighty. There was an interesting Bible teacher that lived in the 1800s. Some of you may be familiar with him. His name was John Nelson Darby. Any of y'all know who he is? Born in 1800, died in 1882. Was a very influential teacher. He was an Anglo-Irish Bible teacher, so he would have a neat accent, I'm sure. It'd be neat to hear him preach. Very influential. Is one of the men that's credited for the modern day Protestant movement accepting a pre-trib rapture, which I struggle with. I do. I admittedly struggle with it. I don't know where I stand on that. It's tough. It's really tough to answer some of that stuff. But nonetheless, I was raised as pre-trib, and
I definitely won't go. If they ask me, I'll vote for going third.
Yeah, I've struggled with that over the years. I have. I was raised that way all my life, but in recent years, I've really struggled with it some, just from different parts of the Bible. But nonetheless, he was one of the men that was instrumental in the church believing that, especially Baptist churches. But he had a lot of great quotes, and one of his that I love most is he says this, and this is, I'm trying to make an illustration here about kings that think they're being kings but really don't realize who's in control. And this was one of John Nelson Darby's quotes. He says, "God's ways are behind the scenes, but he moves all the scenes he is behind." And I think that's a great statement, and that really illustrates beautifully what is happening here in the first part of chapter 1, and really throughout the book of Daniel for that matter, is that God is moving the scenes while he's behind the scenes.
I don't remember where it is, but it says God sets kings up and he, brings them down.
Yes. Then in verse 3 and 4 here, it says, "The king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish," and then it gives a list here, and we're going to get into that. So, as we've read through Ezekiel in these last weeks, we've noticed that there's been different times where the children of Israel, the children of Judah, were taken exile into Babylon. This is kind of an example of that, but it's a little bit more unique. It's not a mass group of people. It's a small, particular group of people. And you notice that it's very deliberate. The king is intimately involved in this. He speaks unto this man Ashpenaz that he should bring certain of the children of Israel. And then you notice that it said of the king's seed and of the princes. So it's very deliberate and specific in who it is that he's looking for here. So he's wanting people that, the young boys specifically is what he's looking for here. Young, probably anywhere from age maybe 10 up to maybe 18, somewhere in that vicinity. I don't know for certain that's the age, but we believe, most Bible teachers believe, that Daniel, when he is taken, is 15 years of age. No one knows for certain, but that's the general consensus. And so they're looking for specific people. Again, you notice it says children, seed of the king and princes. So in other words, kids that wouldn't, and I'm not trying to diminish anyone, but they're looking for children that come from a certain stock, if you will, a certain heritage. Children that were probably more in urban areas where there would have been related to people of royalty or people that were affluent, kids that would have been educated in schools that were of higher learning, that kind of thing. But then it wasn't just that. Next we see that verse 4 gives 6 specific characteristics that they're looking for in these young men. So I decided to just make a list and just briefly mention a little bit about each one of them. So you notice the first characteristic they mention is no blemish. No blemish. That is to say that there should be nothing on the outward appearance that is like a defect, like crossed eyes or something deformed on the body. No physical handicap. Anything that would make you look a little different. Okay. The next one is well favored. So in other words, not only were they not looking for children that had no handicaps or physical defects, but needed to be good looking, handsome. For some reason, I thought of Hitler trying to project white, blonde. What is the term he used for that? Aryan, yes. It was almost like that. He was looking for a certain look with these young men. The Babylonians were big about that. The next thing it's mentioned is skillful in all wisdom. Okay, so keep in mind, though, he's looking for young people. You're not going to have a ton of wisdom with young people, but I think this is considering their age. Considering what their age would have been, there were probably questions and things they would drill them on and see how quickly they would react. What would be their response? Were they quick on their feet? Was there potential there that you saw that was raw potential? This kid could really be something, that kind of thing. Again, how they went through this, I don't know. But there must have had some way to do it. The next thing is mentioned is cunning and knowledge. In other words, not just that they had knowledge of things that kids their age would have knowledge, but they're testing the depth of that knowledge. How deep can it go? Again, there must have been some type of aptitude test, something they did to determine.
It doesn't take long. You just have to be around them.
But I wondered though about that. You're probably right to an extent, but what I wondered is if this was something that was a little longer in determining all 6 characteristics, if there's not something where they actually go through an actual physical, different type of testing, timed testing, drilling from certain people. If this wasn't something that could have been weeks or even a month long, I don't know.
Put them in a class.
Could have, yeah.
And discussion and how fast they learned and stuff. You can kind of, if you let them talk, they'll tell you.
They will. That is true, and you would know that as good as anyone. And being that I'm around.
You'll hear from the adults, other adults in the area will let you know.
Yeah. The next one that's mentioned is understanding science. Even today, those kids would stand out. Not too many kids are real proficient in science. That's what would make my son-in-law a little different. He is very proficient in science. He would be noticed. And then the last thing it's mentioned is the ability to stand in the king's palace. In other words, so it wouldn't make a difference if the other 5 attributes were, if a kid had all 5 of those attributes, but he wasn't able to articulate any of the things that he demonstrated that were positive. In other words, he couldn't be around people that were in the king's palace that were dignitaries or people that were wise men, astrologers. In other words, they couldn't express their views if they were a recluse and they couldn't speak. It wouldn't make any difference if they had all the other 5 characteristics that they were looking for, they had to have the ability to articulate this in settings that would normally intimidate most kids. And so they're looking for that type of kid to be able to express their view. They wouldn't be intimidated at all. One last thing you could say, too, is that you notice that it says at the bottom of verse 4, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So there's one other attribute they're looking for there. They're looking for teachable children, teachable young men, probably also needed to be able to learn a different language, and we'll get into that in a minute. They weren't going to be using their native tongue. And so, again, I don't know if they're prior to this reading of what we have here in this instance, if there was already a protocol in place by the Babylonians that they used in the past to determine all this, or if this was something new. So perhaps if it was something they had used in the past, then they had reformed it and refined it to a place where they knew this is the program that worked best, and this was the kind of kid you'd want to look for. But nonetheless, it does appear that they had a system in place, or it appears to me that they did, to select the best of the best, if you would, for lack of a better term. Then verse 5. And so after they've picked these young men, verse 5 says, and the king, again, you see the king in verse 3, you see the king in verse 5. The king is intimately involved in this process. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and the wine which the king drank. That's interesting. So now you're seeing that whatever the king eats, these young men are going to eat. The same food. The exact same food. So the king is involved in their diet. So the Babylonians have a very organized set course here. It was all inclusive. And I mean all inclusive. It went far beyond just what we just read on food. It was obviously education. We just mentioned that in verses 3 and 4. But it was to include all facets of their life. They wanted them to adapt to the Babylonian culture. They wanted them to learn their language. They wanted to change the way they dressed, the food they ate, their entertainment, their worship. You could call this an indoctrination, because that's essentially what it really was. And so you see there, it says at the bottom of verse 5, the last half of verse 5, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they may stand before the king. So again, going back to this system they have in place, either they're just now determining it, or based on prior experience, they know that 3 years is a good period of time.
I think of the word brainwash.
Yeah.
So that they would not just have that ability, but their loyalty would be to the king.
That's true. Yeah, and essentially, so that not only are they learning all of these things, but and brainwash is a good one, because then you're replacing what they had in them by default with the new indoctrination, the new education, the new food, the culture, language, everything that went with it.
It keeps rolling in my mind that the characteristics, I think they would have to find those with self-control to stand with dignitaries and everything, and not blurt out what they think is right. And, that's why I would not be chosen, because
You'd be a good Daniel then, perhaps.
I don't know, no. But in there, they had to, they're smart and everything, but they had to know when to speak, when not to speak. They had to have self-control.
The other thing, too, that we never really talk about in this book is all these guys were yanked away from everything they knew. They're yanked away from their homes, the familiar surroundings, their friends, and they're moved to a country where it is a complete culture shock. Nobody talks the same. Nobody dresses the same. The food's different. The whole culture is different. It would be like us being moved to North Korea. It'd be a shock. And at that age, I think it'd be really tough. But again, children, I know something about this. I know a little something about this at that age. And so you adapt. you adjust. And that's what these boys did. And I think the Babylonians also understood that too. That kids can adjust easier. So then verses 6 and 7. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, and then we see the names that they were replaced with. So here we are introduced to 4 of the ones that were chosen by the Babylonians. There's a couple things I want to note about this. First, I like the wording. It says, among these were. Okay, so that tells us that it wasn't just these 4. We don't know the number of children that were chosen. But again, from my studies on this, and I've taught on this passage multiple times through the years of my 20 years of teaching, and as best I can tell, most Bible teachers say it's around 50. I don't know, but I've always kind of used that number just based on where I've studied. So it's quite a few of them nonetheless. The second thing is that we see they were given new names by Babylon. And there's something that stands out with this, about these new names. Because after chapter 1, something changes with these. And you all know what it is. You studied this book before. Chapter 1 is the only chapter that gives the Hebrew names for Daniel's 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Is that right? Did I say them right? Yeah. And so after chapter 1, you see these 3 young boys, their Babylonian name is used, not their Hebrew name, which is interesting. But in Daniel's case, the only time you hear him really called Belteshazzar is here. And it's really just one time that he's referenced by that. I have some thoughts on that. If we have time at the end, I'll get to it. But if you're interested, you may not even care what I think. But anyway, I made some notes on that. And if we have time, if you care, you can ask and we'll talk about it. But that is interesting. Then verse 8. And I took verse 8 and I kind of did like a verse 8a and then 8b. I want to divide this up. So it says in verse 8, the beginning, the first part of it, but Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine he drank. I hear people all the time say they have a life verse. You know, we were at a funeral that was a very sad funeral a couple of weeks ago for a 20-year-old that was killed in our church. And he had a life verse. His was Philippians 4:13. I can just tell you straight up, I'm not that spiritual. I don't have a life verse. I just don't. I know you guys are just shocked. I don't have a life verse. You know why? There's just too many good ones. You can't pick out one. There's no way. But I would say that if I had to pick out one, the first part of this verse 8 of chapter 1 is my life verse. But Daniel purposed in his heart. I love those 6 words. But Daniel purposed in his but Daniel purposed in his heart. Woo! I'm so excited. I'm getting my mouth ahead of my brain. I was so excited to teach this lesson this week. There is so much depth to that statement. But Daniel purposed in his heart. You know what it tells me? It tells me that Daniel is not living his faith spontaneously. You know, think about most kids this age at 15. They're living life without much thought about past the hour they're living in. They're living their whole life spontaneously, not to mention their faith. But this says Daniel had purposed. You notice it's in the past. He'd already determined what he would do. His faith was determined and premeditated, or predetermined, you could say. And it almost gives me the idea that he knew in advance how he would react to a moment like this. He had purposed in his heart, not in his head, in his heart. That's why I say it's not spontaneous. If you have something in your heart, it's much deeper than in your head. At least that's the way I feel about it. So it tells me that he was raised by some godly parents and godly mentors in his life that kind of just prepared him. He kind of almost knew that moments like this might come. And when it did, he was ready. He purposed in his heart. He was prepared. And then the second half of verse 8 says, therefore, because he had purposed, therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So while Daniel was already prepared in his mind, he had the mindset of being prepared, his approach shouldn't be ignored. Because notice how it says it. He requested. He didn't demand. He requested. You sense a respect factor there. He didn't, say, I will not.
He didn't pitch a fit.
No, he didn't pitch a fit. And so many Christians miss the importance of displaying our faith with respect. Sometimes we put so much focus on taking a stand for Christ instead of, and not putting emphasis on how we take a stand. Taking a stand for Christ is great, but how we take a stand is just as important. You can really hurt your faith by taking a stand if you don't do it properly. And so it says Daniel requested. So the way we obey God is just as important as the obedience. Yes, sir.
It's interesting to note they did not object to receiving the wisdom, the learning, and the skill of the Babylonians. They did not object to the name changes. They did not object to any of those particular stipulations being placed upon them. They objected to those things which specifically would have put them at odds with God's word. You see in chapter 2, the eating of the food, particular kinds of foods. In chapter 3, the bowing down to an idol, and the issue of prayer later in Daniel 9. When it became an issue of God's word, they stood firm. But they submitted to everything else.
That's interesting.
Because it wasn't in clear violation of a specific commandment from God.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. Well, keep in mind, Daniel's requesting. So there's a respect factor here. He's taking a stand, but he's taking it properly. And then we have verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. I don't think it's any accident that verse 9 is after verse 8. I know it's numerically, it has to. But what I'm saying is what the content of verse 8 and verse 9 is. I believe that some of the favor that he had was not just because the prince of the eunuchs, when he first saw Daniel, looked at him and said, yeah, he's a good-looking kid. I like him. I think it was something else. I think whatever the reaction, I don't know how much interaction there was between the actual prince of the eunuchs, because you notice Melzar is mentioned, and Melzar seems to be the go-between between the prince of the eunuchs and Daniel. So I don't know how much direct conversation there was between the prince of the eunuchs and Daniel, but there must have been some. But I can't help but feel that the favor that was shown to Daniel, now, mind you, I know God's involved in this. I'm not discounting that. But I still, in my mind, feel like that the requesting, the respect factor from Daniel is part of what brought favor with this prince of the eunuchs. And so I think that's important to note. Then verse 10. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, now again, this is through a third party, through Melzar, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your meat and your drink. Why should he see your faces worse than the liking of the children which are your sort? In other words, your comrades, your buddies that you came with. Then you will endanger my head to the king. And I think, by the way, that's literal. He probably had seen it before. He'd probably seen some contemporaries that had literally lost their head because they did not conform with what the king wanted or obey the king. So let me just back up for a second, though. If Daniel had not respected the authority, the prince of the eunuchs, Melzar, whoever, and then the prince of the eunuchs did not have favor for Daniel, I don't think this conversation in verse 10 even happens. Because typically, if one of the Hebrew boys had just demanded he wasn't going to do something, the prince of the eunuchs would be like, no, shut that down right now. Huh, no, I'm not losing my head for you, buddy. You will eat that and you'll drink that, and that's the way it's going to be. But you see here, because of the respect and because of the favor that exists between Daniel and the prince of the eunuchs, this man is willing to contemplate risking his life for a 15-year-old boy. When you think about that, that's pretty amazing. Which tells you another thing here. God can use a pagan to accomplish his will. Because I doubt that this prince of the eunuchs or Melzar, either one were followers of God, if they even knew who he was. So God uses, we've seen this with President Trump, God uses people that don't appear to be spiritual people to accomplish his will. And God willing, we might see Roe versus Wade directly eradicated in this 49th year because of a man who was not a godly man that appointed some Supreme Court judges and others across our land. At the very least, we are going to see abortion diminished and much more. Lives will be saved. They're already being saved in Texas as we speak. So God uses pagans to do his will. And here he uses one with Daniel. I also wondered this too. This is me just speculating. But I wondered if Melzar and the prince of the eunuchs ever became followers of God as a direct, just having that relationship with Daniel. I wondered. Don't know. Then verses 11 through 13. Then said Daniel, this is a response to the king, the prince of the eunuchs saying, hey, should I endanger my head, if you're not eating? Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, in verse 12, prove your servants, I beg you, 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then verse 13, then let our countenances be looked upon and compare us. Compare us to the one that's eating the king's meat and the king's wine and see which ones are better. Quite a proposal here, isn't it? I thought this is a pretty ingenious proposal that a 15-year-old's coming up with here. I thought it was pretty smart. Because really what it does is it in some ways, first of all, when we go back to the initial selection process when they're trying to find kids with wisdom, well, here's another example of Daniel exhibiting some wisdom right here. This is one of the reasons they picked him. This is a pretty good solution, I think. It gives him 10 days, a 10-day trial, if you will. And so it kind of benefits both parties. It benefits Melzar and the prince of the eunuchs because they're not having to extend out too far. 10 days surely can't do too much damage, But it's enough that you have a comparable difference between the other 46, we'll say 46, I don't know if it's that number, but 46 that are eating the king's meat and the 4 that aren't. So I thought that was a pretty good little solution that Daniel comes up with, and for a 15-year-old, that's, again, exhibiting his wisdom. Then verse 14. And so the prince of the eunuch consents in this matter and gives them 10 days. Now, I don't want to underestimate the risk that Melzar and the prince of the eunuchs are taking here. They are taking a risk. They're disobeying the king, are they not? And I think that's something we ought to consider. But I want to park here for something else for just a minute. I'm going to try not to get too preachy on this, but there's some really, really good stuff here. You could really, if you wanted to, criticize, and some the Hebrew boys might have, the contemporaries of Daniel and his three friends, could have said, what you guys are taking a stand on, is this the mountain you really want to die on? Just for this? For some meat and drink? But obviously, I don't have time to get into the details. You know why it was an issue. I know most of you have been in church long enough. You understand why this was an issue and why they couldn't. But let me just expand this out a little bit. let's just say you know of some Christian brothers and sisters that have taken a stand that you think is a little on the petty side. You don't understand why they would not just go along with something that's really not a big deal in the Bible. It's not one of the hated sins. Why won't you just, why do you want to rock the boat? Just go along. And you probably have known some that have been like that. But the thing is we don't know their struggles. You don't know their relationship with God. You don't know where, to them, it would be a compromise. It could really cause an issue. For instance, on the issue of not drinking, that's one of mine. Not everybody will agree with me. I get it. People in this church probably don't agree with me. I don't drink, never have drank, never had a drink in my life, ever. Will not. It is a mountain I will die on. I will not take a drink. You can take that to the bank. It will not happen. I will die before I take a drink. You say, well, that's stupid. Okay, that's your right to say that. But I believe in my personal life, first of all, I was 14 years old, a year younger than Daniel, when I made a vow to God I would never take a drink. And I'm not going to. And for me, it would affect my relationship with my God. And how dare you criticize me for it? But just on the other hand, I could see things in your life that I think are absurd. I mean, I do some silly things, like on my phone, I've got all kinds of filters. That's my thing. You can knock me if you want, but that's my thing. I don't think any man should have a phone that don't have a filter. But I'm not going to criticize you if you don't. But it would affect my relationship with my God, so I have these things I won't compromise on. That's just who I am. I have a brother, he's of another faith. He doesn't believe that he should wear any shirt that's not long sleeve. He's holiness. Petty to me, but you know what? Who am I to criticize him? His wife doesn't cut his hair. Don't cut her hair. I have no problem with that. I think women look good with hair. I like hair. I don't like it when I can't tell the difference. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's a problem for me. The Bible says a woman's hair is her glory. And there's a lot to that. And I've met some, I saw some woman that had some beautiful hair, and then it turned around and it was a guy. It's her glory, not his. So the bottom line is that we are to be different. And compromising is, if there's a problem in the church today, it's compromise. I say this all the time. There's a line, and for some reason when the line of the world just keeps moving, the Christians just keep moving with it. And what God was saying is we're supposed to be peculiar people, weird people, strange people. And you know what makes us peculiar? Is the fact our line never changes. So when the world goes, they just keep going. And when they look back at us, they're like, weird. They're not moving with us. No, because they don't compromise. So the Bible Methodists, the holiness, all their, hey, I have nothing but respect for you. You have a line. You won't cross it. I think some of your things are silly. So be it. You have a line. I respect your line. And I love the fact that Daniel, that was his line. The other thing too is it could be a thing that, for instance, is not a sin. It's not a sin. It's not listening to the Bible as a sin. But it could hurt your testimony. And if you compromised on it, it could hurt your testimony. I know of some people who do things that aren't wrong, but I wish they wouldn't, just because it hurts their testimony. And they're not the Christian they ought to be because of it. All right, I'm done. I told you I was going to try not to preach.
They weren't supposed to eat meat, though. Why did they?
Well, it was the kind of meat. Probably like pork or, something that the Jews were not allowed to eat.
Offered and sacrificed.
Yeah, that too. Yep.
But I thought, we're not supposed to eat meat.
Well, people would use this verse as kind of to push a thing.
I am never going to get all this. I'm never going to get all this in, but I'm gonna really try. Verse 15. I shouldn't have parked there that long. Verse 15. This lesson's so good. Oh, I love this chapter. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. So Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine which they should drink and gave them veggies. Now, we could overlook something very easily here. It says that at the end of 10 days, He said, well, that don't sound very long. But wait a minute. It did take some commitment for 10 days to not eat anything but veggies and water. And they stuck to it. But that wasn't the end of it. In case you think that was a great commitment, look at verse 16. So what happens in verse 16? So he takes away the portion of the meat and the wine that they should drink and give them veggies. But guess what? What you're not reading into that is, guess what that means? For 3 years, they don't eat nothing but veggies and water. We never talk about that. So they didn't just go for 10 days. They went for 3 years. You don't think that'd be hard? Okay, so they're eating in the cafeteria and they smell the pork chops and the ham. And you don't think that was a little on the tempting side? I mean, that was quite a stand they took in a way. There's one other angle to this you could take as well. Let's remember something. Daniel, like I mentioned earlier, Daniel and his friends and all these Hebrews are taken away from their home. Okay, that's the bad part. But the good part is, if you're a Hebrew, you could do what you want. No mom, no dad, no teacher, no mentor, nobody at boarding school telling what you can and can't do. They could easily be adapted to the old mantra, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Or when in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do.
Yeah, but
Or-
there might be eunuchs to do like eunuchs do.
Or they could have said, what happens in Babylon stays in Babylon. You know, they could have very easily have done it. And by the way, you Christian men know this. You know this is fact. I can't speak for you women, but you Christian men know this. How easy is it when you're away from your home, away from accountability, away, that it's easy to be tempted? This is why Billy Graham and other preachers like him, when they'd go to places, they would never stay in a hotel room by themselves. So they'd have the TV ripped out. They didn't want any temptations. They would never counsel with a woman in a room with unless there was another woman there or something. They never put themselves in a situation. And when men are away, sometimes there are temptations. There are liberties we feel like we can take because we're not in our domicile. We're not around the people that hold us accountable. But the thing about it is that God can hear when nobody else does. God can see when no one else sees. We have to keep that in mind. And this 15-year-old boy understood that. 15-year-old boy. How many 15-year-old boys think like that? You can also add this to it. These boys had every excuse possible that they could make. They could say, we're in exile. Our God that we were trained in has forgotten us. They had, obviously, the other Hebrew boys, that's the attitude they took, but not Daniel and his 3 friends. Instead, you see these 4 boys honor their mentors, honor their parents, but most importantly, honor their God. It's just a beautiful story. Don't we need more young men like that today? And I tell you, I pray for my grandsons. Man, I pray for them. I'm hoping that I've got Ami, Titus, and I have Gideon, and I'm praying they are like the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm just praying they're going to be those kind of boys that will, and I'm hoping one of them will be a Daniel, be the leader, but at the very least be followers of a leader that they'll follow the example of. Then verses 17 through 21. I'm going to try to close this out real quickly here. So after these 3 years, okay, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams, which we'll get to in later upcoming weeks. Now at the end of the days that the king said he should bring him in, this is 3 years, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them. In other words, he drilled them hard. He found them 10 times better. That is no small number. 10 times better than all the learned magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. Whew, that's pretty impressive, I'd say. Now, I want to just say a couple things there as we get to the end of this here and close this out. Now, we know later in the book, we know Daniel. Daniel he had no issue standing alone. He had no issue taking a stand all by himself. But here he's got three friends. Three friends out of the other, out of the 50, three of them were influenced by Daniel. And I don't doubt that it benefited Daniel having three people stand with him. Do you not think it did? I do. And I think that, at the very least, we don't know. This is just speculation. But maybe these three friends are what gave him what he needed for the future. Maybe he would have stood here by himself. I don't know. But he had three friends that stood with him. And it made a difference. And he was an influence on these three friends. I've mentioned this illustration before, but I thought of it again as I was studying this week. So if you've flown at night, you know how it is when you're just starting to descend and you're coming in to the larger cities where airports normally are, and you start to see the lights and the cars moving and all that stuff. It's kind of cool. We all like that part when you're landing. It's fun. But what I always love, my favorite part about landing is seeing the lights, like street lights, where you can see the actual circumference, the radius of how far the light extends. You can't see that at ground level. If you see a street light, you just see the street light. You can't tell at ground level where it stops and where it ends, in other words, where the edge of the light, because let's just face it, every light has a certain amount, I don't know what you would call it, I'm not sure what the terminology is you determine, what would you say that? A light has so many, lumens or wattage, but I mean, what would be the term you use to determine how far out it goes? Like the circumference or radius, something like that. But so you can't see that at ground level, but when you're in the sky, you can see the literal, like on a car, when a car is moving, you can see the light shining from the car, but you can see where it ends. You can't tell that necessarily on the ground. You can't measure it. But from above, you could measure it. You could literally tell, okay, that light affects 50 yards or 25 feet. But you notice that each light is different. So the brighter the light, you can tell the circumference spreads out further. And really, that is what we are like as Christians. We're all those lights. It's just some of us shine brighter than others. And so some of the reasons that is, your light might be brighter than mine, Ken, but it might be because your spiritual dedication and your prayer life and your Bible reading and your dedication to God makes you brighter. And you have more of an impact than do I. So your spiritual life can determine your brightness and your impact on your realm of influence, let's call it. Realm of influence. But then, it's not always the case. You might be more spiritual than me. You might be more dedicated in your faith. But let's just say maybe your disposition. I'm picking on you a little bit because you're quiet. Your disposition, you're not a gab mouth like me. I run at the mouth. I got diarrhea of the mouth, but you don't. So your disposition might diminish your realm of influence because you don't talk as much. It doesn't mean you don't have influence. It just means that I have a bright light that shines bright a lot because I talk a lot. And so my influence sometimes is good and bad. Sometimes you don't need bright light. There are times it needs to go down. But maybe I don't have that filter. So the point is that some of the things, the way God makes us, determines my realm of influence. So for instance, I'll never be an Adrian Rogers. If you would have looked at him from the sky, his light was really bright. And if you're at ground level, you see his light from a lot further distance than you would see me. You have to really keep going to see my light. And so some of it's determined by just who we are as people. Some of it's determined by our spiritual maturity. Yes, sir.
It's all the same thing. You look around in the church and you see different brands of Christians. You got the quiet in the land. You got, they're the prayer warriors. They're the solid, the foundation. They're the ones that determine the longevity of any local church. And then you got your off-the-wall, nut job, crazy, extroverted Christian. He pushes the envelope, he stretches the boundaries, he goes beyond what is required. And then, the foundation look at him and say, man, he's nuts, he's a radical. And he looks at the back and says, man, y'all are cold and lukewarm. Both are necessary.
Yeah.
Both are needed. You need
Right.
that strong foundation that, has the longevity of the church to continue. And then you need that half-cocked, flies by the seat of his pants, passionate, motivated, radical, just going, pushing the envelope. You need that kind of person too. So the church needs
Then the quieter ones fill in and hold.
And the other thing too about lights too, sometimes I am a incandescent. You have to replace me a lot. Daniel was an LED. He just never burned out. He was consistent his whole life. What a light he was throughout his whole life. And by the way, you see that it says at the last verse at the end of 21. I think this is interesting because the verse 21 kind of like, it's weird that they would put this verse at the end of chapter 1. You'd think it'd be at the end of the book. But it says here, and Daniel continued even till his first year of King Cyrus, which was about 70 years. So his light was shining all throughout that. Isn't that a great study? There's so much I missed. I know you probably want to add a whole bunch to this. Is there anything just like really obvious that I missed that you wanted to add? Anybody on Zoom?
I think that lights don't light up on their own. Depends on the size of the outlet that they're plugged into. So if you tried to plug a stadium light into your home, it's gonna blow everything,
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
The size of the outlet, and that comes from your relationship. with
It does. Yeah, that's good. I would think, I can't believe I missed that. That sounds like something I would catch, but that's good. Any other thoughts on this book? I'll just say this real quick. I did make some notes. I don't know if you have any interest in the name thing about the Daniel and the fact that we see Daniel's Hebrew name mentioned throughout the book, but we don't see what's their? Yeah, I was going to say their Hebrew names, but we know their. Isn't it funny that we don't really know their Hebrew names? We know their Babylonian names, but on the other end, we don't really remember Belshazzar.
Because they used those names in the song that we sing.
And that's true. That is true. That is true. One of the things that I thought about this is pure speculation. First of all, Daniel was the author of Daniel. And it appears to me Daniel never accepted his Babylonian name, and he didn't want it recorded in here. And so he used his name. He didn't do the same for his three friends, though. He used their Babylonian names. So to me, it's interesting because it makes me wonder if in the end they just accepted their names. But Daniel refused to. I don't really know. You might have some thoughts on that, but that was just something I thought of this week. I ponder these things that are useless things to think about. But nonetheless, I like to rationalize them in my head. Well, that's just the beginning of our study in Daniel. It's a good one, and it's a wonderful book. Wonderful book. And wonderful first chapter. Love it. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. And I hope you guys have a great week. Father, thank you for this 15-year-old boy that had, wow, what a stand he took. I am so excited to meet Daniel when we get to heaven. There's so many guys I want to meet and ladies I want to meet. Daniel has to be one of the top ones. I appreciate the steadfastness, he purposed in his heart. Oh God, help me this week to not live my faith spontaneously, but to be prepared and be purposed before it even happens. Because it's going to happen. I pray that for my brothers and sisters as well. Use us this week in a way you can only use us, and help us not to forget Daniel. I pray for our pastor as he speaks. I pray that you guide his tongue and may he feed his sheep today. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. See you guys. Have a great week. See y'all on Zoom. Thanks for being here.